3 for the care and nurturing cluster. Today in this webinar, we'll be covering the content for assessment 3, the workplace portfolio assessment for this cluster. Remember, assessment 3 or the portfolio assessment is the assessment that you'll complete while you're on work placement. So to get to this point, you would have already completed assessments 1 and 2 for the care and nurturing cluster. You'll be on work placement and you'll be completing this as part of your work placement task. I'll begin by sharing the screen, and what we'll do is I'll just be going through each of the aspects of the workplace assessment and just elaborating on the requirements for you. So I'll share my screen. So you'll see there that the first task is a reflective journal task. It's where you need to think about the health and safety of the children in the childcare service where you've been doing your work placement. So rather than leave this assessment to the end of your work placement, it's highly recommended that you complete the assessment 3s for each of the Group A cluster of units while you're on work placement, that you try and work on each of these assessments throughout your work placement period. So by about, day 2 or day 3, you probably would have noticed a few situations where the health or safety of children might have been compromised. So as I said, rather than leave it to the end of work placement where you're racking your brain to think, what happened, try and visit this assessment every evening and think, what is it that I did today, and what information have I learnt, or what practices have I engaged in that I could then use as part of my responses to some of the questions in this assessment. So have a think about what you've noticed in the childcare service where the health or safety of children might have been compromised. So as I said, this could even be on your first day. You might have noticed something in the childcare service that you could document here. It could be something as simple as I noticed a broken toy on the floor. It could be that you noticed one of the rugs on the floor was bent and was posing a trip hazard. Now, here in this question, you can write about situations that you noticed and you acted on, or you can write about situations that you noticed other educators notice and act on. So if you've noticed the broken toy or you've noticed the rug, that's great. That's 2 examples. But then you might have also noticed that another educator noticed that the front gate wasn't quite closing properly. So it's not something that you, in fact, noticed, but you noticed another educator notice it. So it can be either of those examples. Other situations where the health or safety of children might have been compromised might be when there might have been something something broken, as I said, something not working properly. Perhaps there was a breakdown in supervision somewhere. Perhaps you've noticed a child running around the outdoor environment without their hat on. Perhaps you've noticed at meal times a child dropped their food and then, it was a bicky or something, then they picked it up and they continued to eat it, or another child taking food off another child's plate, those sorts of things. So any examples that you notice or that you notice other educators notice where the health and safety of children are compromised, you just need to briefly describe the situation. Just pick 3. And then for each of those 3, you need to write down what action was taken. So, in the example of a child who might have dropped some food on the floor, you might have noticed the action taken was an educator came over and, said to the child, "Oh no, that's dirty now. let's get you a nice clean one. We can't eat that one. We'll put it in the bin and let's get you another cracker. So you'll write down that was the corrective action. And then in terms of how that's, aligned with the workplace policies and procedures, you then say that, this aligns to the food safety policy. You might have noticed, again, one child trying to take food off another child's plate. The corrective action might be an educator stepping in to stop that from happening. Again, that aligns to the food safety policy. The rug that you might have noticed that had a bit of a buckle in it and posed a trip hazard, and you flattened it out, that would be that's your action, that you lifted it up and relayed it so that it had no trip hazards, and that would be in line with your workplace work health and safety policy, where you've identified a hazard and taken action. If it's something a bit more kind of long term, like a gate that's not closing properly, the corrective action might be that the service might have to barricade that gate up for a time until it can be fixed, and the families might need to enter and exit through a different gate. And again, that's in line with the work health and safety policies, but it also might line up with, the policies that look at arrival and departures and safety around that. So just get really familiar with the service's different policies that they have, particularly in relation to keeping children safe and healthy. So that would be work health and safety policy, the food policy, arrival and collection policies, medication policies, etc., etc. Then for each of the 3 situations that you've chosen above, you then need to explain those corrective actions in relation to either legal obligations, parent communication responsibilities, documentation and record keeping. So the gate example, you would need to talk to your workplace supervisor about what's the procedure now? How is that documented? Ask the educators to show you so that you learn, and then you can record that here, how it's documented. There's probably a maintenance book recorded, and then a maintenance officer will come in to fix that. Where does that maintenance report get filed? Is the director part of that process? Of course they are. If one of your examples of children's health and safety being compromised could have been broken glass found in the sandpit, and that might have been identified via the morning outdoor checklist. And the corrective action, of course, was that it was removed. Educators would have put their gloves on, double bagged it, and put it in a bin, not inside the playroom, but in a bin outside the playroom where children can't access it. So what documentation? Well, that would be the outdoor safety checklist. Where does that get filed? Ask the service and write that down. With some of your examples, there might need to be parent communication. For example, the wonky gate. So how are parents informed about that? Are they informed via a big notice? Are they emailed? Does it go up on their Story Park or similar app? All those sorts of things. So just watch and listen and learn. And if you're not sure, just ask questions about the documentation and record keeping practices. Then you'll need to be focusing on supervision. So here what you need to do is pick a play period or a play activity that you supervised. So not other educators, but something that you were supervising. And of course there would be you're never with children alone, so there would be an educator from the service with you, but you need to be not just watching on, you need to be actively supervising yourself. So identify the activity here. So it might be that you're supervising children on a balance beam, or you might be supervising children during water play outside, or you might be supervising a dramatic play situation up in the cubby house or on a stage, or you might be supervising cutting with scissors indoors. So choose a play episode where you were supervising and just write about the play that the children were involved in. What type of play was it? Then you need to describe how you've applied the principles of active supervision to supervise that particular play. So remember, you would have learnt about active supervision and the principles involved through your learning on the TDC. Can you just hold on 1 minute? I've just got someone at the door. I'm going to have to pause this recording. Sorry about that interruption. I'll just reshare my screen. So we were talking about the principles of active supervision. So what you'll need to do here is you need to address each one of those principles in relation to the activity that you chose. So say, for example, you did choose to supervise water play, then you just need to use these little subheadings of the principles. So write down knowing as a subheading, and then think about what you kind of knew about the whole environment of the water play. So, I knew where all the children were positioned. I knew where the equipment that the children were going to be using were in relation to where they were. I knew that I was supervising in a shaded position. So it's about that awareness of the total environment. I was also aware, or I knew about what other activities or experiences or play was going on around the water play. In terms of listening, and also, I guess, coming back to knowing, focusing on, I knew that there was some younger children who required a lot more support and a lot more supervision. I knew that there was going to be quite a lot of interest in the water play because we haven't done that for quite a long period of time. So I was expecting to be supervising, a fairly large group of children most of the time. In terms of listening, you would need to be reflecting on the fact that you listened to different sounds in the environment to notice whether, play was escalating, whether conflict might have been bubbling under the surface. You were listening out for unusual sounds, or even just listening for silence as well. I noticed that a child had started off quite enthusiastic and talkative, but then all of a sudden felt silent. And I wonder why that might have been the case. Positioning, where did you position yourself? So you positioned yourself in a spot where you could see all of the children. You positioned yourself in a spot perhaps closest to a child who had an additional need or a younger child who needed more support. You positioned yourself so that you were still able to access the children and the water play really, really quickly. You weren't positioned a long way back and looking at the water play from afar, that you were positioned right there in case you were needed. And also positioning, I guess, you could talk about whether you moved position throughout that activity as well. You didn't just stay planted in that one spot where you started. And then finally, scanning, you'll talk about the fact that you scanned all of the children, you were scanning all of the equipment. You were also not just scanning the water play, but you were scanning the broader environment as well to notice what else was happening around you. Then what you need to do is, in relation to that one activity, so again, if we're using the water play example, you need to talk about how you adjusted supervision throughout the water play experience. So with water play, in terms of the play area, you'll be writing here that that continuous supervision is required, that there needs to be an adult present, and there was always an adult present the whole time that water was out, because we know that that's a high risk activity for children. In terms of the skill, you'll be talking about the fact that you supervised. I'm just also thinking too with the play area, because it's an outdoor activity with water, constant supervision, but you'd also need to make sure that you supervise not just the water safety, but also the sun safety, because it's an outdoor activity. So you can mention that as well. In terms of the skill, just write down the skills that you observed the children demonstrate as you supervised. So this links really closely to the age mix as well. But if you've noticed, you know, some children that were a lot more skillful, then perhaps they needed much less supervision than those children who had less skill at, say, pouring the water or moving around the water trough or being able to reach the equipment that they wanted. So you could write here about how you adjusted supervision for different skills because you supervise those more highly skilled children a little bit less and those less skilled a little bit more. In terms of the age mix, again, you need to adjust your supervision for age because, again, when younger children come to the water trough, you need to make sure that you, again, supervise more diligently. Dynamics is about the different groups of children that come. So you will need to adjust your supervision if there was conflict between individual children. Did that happen? Was there some children who came and started to dominate and taking some of the resources from the water trough off other children? And that affected the group dynamics. And did you have to supervise the turn taking of equipment because of some of the children coming that were wanting to dominate or take over or not playing with regard to the younger children at the water trough? The size of the group, so obviously the larger the group or the more children that were coming, the more vigilant you needed to be in your supervision, the more scanning you might need to do, the more movement around the water trough you would need to undertake. All, as opposed to if there's just one child at the water trough. If the size of the group got too big for your supervision, you might have needed to ask children to sort of go to a different play area and come back later when there was some space, because overcrowding can cause conflict. Or you might have needed to call on another educator to really come and actively supervise with you if the group got a little bit too large. The level of risk involved, so with water play, or if you'd chosen cutting with scissors, the level of risk would be quite high, as would, climbing on balance beams if that was your activity that you chose to supervise. If you were supervising painting, for example, or if you were supervising children perhaps playing with blocks, the level of risk would be lower. Of course, supervision still required. Then what you need to do is outline a time where you've exchanged information with colleagues to ensure active or adequate supervision at all times. So this would just be you writing down an example where you've had to call in another educator to help you. Perhaps there's been conflict, perhaps the dynamics have changed and the play is getting a little bit more rigorous and physical and a little bit aggressive and you're feeling a little bit uncomfortable. So just write down how you have called in another educator and what the scenario was. Describe the processes you have followed in your service for the safe collection of children. So watch and learn, but you can also ask questions of staff at the service also about the process that they follow regarding, signing in and signing out of children as they arrive and as they leave the service at the end of the day. Most services now have electronic sign-in, but that's just part of the process. It's a good idea even to ask for the service's arrival and collection policy and have a read through that, because the staff will be following that policy. And basically, if you summarise that policy, you'll be describing their process. But, you'll need to be recording information here about what's the service process when someone other than the child's family is coming to pick up the child. What about if a parent wants to come early? What's the process for that? So again, watch and learn, read the policy and ask some questions and just describe that process there. Outline an example of how you've assisted in the supervision of people who enter the service and how you've observed and documented this using the service's sign in and sign out forms. I'm just thinking, it's very similar. I've probably answered that also when I've talked about 2.4. I see, yeah, the difference here is how you've assisted in the supervision of people. Yeah, exactly. So following the process that you've outlined at 2.4, what you need to do is just write down an example of how you have helped a family member sign in or sign out. Maybe someone's come to you and they've arrived early. What have you done? Obviously, you aren't, as a student, allowed to just authorise people to sign out early or for other people other than the child's family to sign their child out. You're not authorised to do those things, but how you then directed them to a staff member to follow that process. So again, it'll be very similar to what's in 2.4, but it's just a time where you've actually been part of that process. This here is looking at journals around identifying hazards and risks. So give an example of an occasion where you've checked the safety of buildings, equipment and the environment to identify any hazards. So the situation would be where you have been involved in, with another educator, completing the indoor or outdoor safety checklist. So every day these are done just to make sure that the environment is safe for children when they arrive at the childcare service. So that would be your situation, on such and such a date. With this particular educator, I completed the indoor safety checklist. You can keep a copy of that and put that into your work placement folder. Were there any hazards identified? Well, that will be on the checklist, so write them here if they were, and the policies or procedures that you were required to follow in relation to reporting. So again, talking to your staff like, oh, okay, we did notice there was some broken glass in the sandpit. What was the procedure that you followed? How did you report that? Who did you report that to? Explain how you've used positive and developmentally appropriate communication when discussing with children the safety requirements of a play experience. So you're just writing down here a time where you have had to talk with a child, either preemptively, like to forewarn them, or it might have been after something's happened and you've reflected with the child about next time we need to be a bit more careful. But it could be about, talking to children about being careful when they climb on the balance beam. It might be about talking to children about how to use the scissors in a safe way so they don't cut their fingers. It might be about in the sandpit, talking to children about how we don't splash the water because it wets our friends and then they feel uncomfortable, or it might get in their eye, it might be in the sandpit. You might have to talk to a child about throwing sand in the sandpit. So just write down an example of the situation where you spoke to a child about not splashing, not throwing sand, etc., etc. Write down the words that you used to explain the dangers of what they're doing and the consequences of what they're doing. So write it down as a little anecdote, if you like, of what you said and what you did. And then think about how you were able to develop the children's knowledge of personal safety actions. So, you know, after I talked to the child about not throwing the sand, it helped the child to understand that sand can get into people's eyes and it can really hurt their eyes and can damage their eyes. Explain how dangerous products are stored and labelled. So again, just look, listen and learn. So when you're cleaning tables after a mealtime, where do you put the bottle that you use that had the detergent in it after you've used it? So a lot of stuff's going to be stored in locked cabinets, but again, watch what staff do. Observe your environment, and then if you're not sure, double check with staff how that's all done. So now this is all about supporting children's health. So briefly explain one example of how you've promoted sun safety with children and how you implemented sun safety measures. So that's fairly obvious. So go to the sun safety policy, ask the service if you can have a look at it. If you are able to, attach a photo of their sun safety policy or a copy of that in your work placement folder and refer to that in your response. So you'd be looking at things like how you've helped with applying sunscreen, how often, how long before children go out to play does the sunscreen need to be applied? How often does it need to be reapplied? How did you promote or support children to wear their hats? How did you remind them to wear their hats? Give an example of a situation where you were required to follow the service's risk management strategies for a child with a long-term medical condition. Again, this is not something that you're going to be doing alone, but if you've got a child with, you know, a peanut allergy, any type of anaphylaxis, a person who needs an asthma puffer or a juvenile diabetes injection, insulin tests, insulin injections, all those sorts of things. Maybe it's, a child who needs to avoid gluten, for example. Maybe it's a child who just is on a restrictive diet for some reason. Just write down how you followed that child's, management plan. So it might be obvious, you won't be responsible for administering an EpiPen or giving a puffer, and you might not even see any of that happen in a service. If you don't see anything like this, then write down an example as if it were to happen. This is what I would do. So write it down hypothetically. But otherwise, things around children's food and food requirements and food needs that are associated with a medical condition could be quite easy for you to be involved in and provide an example of. Provide an example of how you've managed risk involved. There we go. So it could be the same as the one that you've used above. So that's pretty straightforward. So again, asking the service for their medication policy and really summarising the service's medication policy here. Give an example of an occasion where you've responded to a child that was unwell. Again, this would be educators responding and you being part of the process, but you are not solely responsible for doing any of this. So how was the child identified as being unwell or being injured? That'll be fairly straightforward. An injury is pretty obvious. Unwell, it might be that the educators might have just noticed that the child was a bit out of sorts or sitting by themselves, or they looked a bit hot and flushed. What steps did you take? Again, you'd be taking these in collaboration with a staff member. So talk about how you took care of the child emotionally, how you reassured them that everything would be okay, how you might have comforted them, and then if there was first aid required, what first aid was administered by the staff, and how did you respond? You might have been the person going to get the first aid kit for the staff member. You might have been the person that had to alert the director rather, that this incident happened. Maybe you're the person that was going to get the bed ready to lie the toddler down while they waited for their parent to come. What measures did you take to prevent cross-contamination? So obviously this is, where hand washing is really important. You would be keeping other children away from the child if it's an illness. And you would be placing the child in an area away from other children while they wait for collection. Describe the reporting procedures. Again, this is just following the workplace policies. So have a look at their illness and accident policy and write down the aspects of the policy that relate to what they need to do when they're reporting. Okay, so that's your supporting evidence if the service will allow. And then explain how you've maintained confidentiality in your service in relation to children's health. So this would involve, that I don't talk about any of the children when I leave the service. I don't talk to my family and friends about things that have happened at the service. The illness reports are filed confidentially in a locked filing cabinet, that you don't leave the incident reports or the accident reports lying around the playroom, that they're immediately tended to and filed. That you don't talk to other families also about the illness or the injury to another child, so that you're not sharing that information with other families. Of course, in the event, of a transmissible disease, the other families will need to know that their child's been in contact with someone that might have, been diagnosed with hand, foot and mouth disease later on, or conjunctivitis. But when you're communicating that information to all of the families, you make sure that you don't identify the child in those communications. It's just, we have had a case of head lice, for example. Now, part 2 is all about cleaning and infection control. So this is really just a matter of completing the table. So what you need to do is write down here, you don't need to address every single one of these. So just pick a piece of equipment and write down an example of the cleaning procedure that you used. So for example, if you were cleaning the change mats, how did you do that? What materials did you need? And when did you do that? If you were cleaning the toileting area, okay, what's the procedure? How often is it done through the day? What's clean? Just the basins, toilets, just the floor? Is signage put up about a wet floor? Is it done what times of the day is it done, etc., etc. What materials do you need? So what cleaning cloths, what mops, what sorts of detergents are used, etc., etc., and when you did that. So don't think that you have to do every single one of these. Okay, one minimum. If you do a couple, that's great, but at least one of those. And the same through here, your furnishings. So again, you might have been responsible for, cleaning some cushions or cleaning a couch or cleaning the chairs. This needs to be soft surfaces, or, you might have washed, a cuddly toy, something like that. So if there was something that you cleaned that was a soft furnishing and it's not on this list, that's okay as well. It might have been that you just got the dust buster out and you vacuumed a cushion, for example. You'll be doing lots of this. So tables and chairs will be done every day. You'll probably be cleaning high chairs every day, and you'll certainly, when you start nappy changing and practicing your nappy change, you'll certainly be cleaning the change table. So you can write down when you do those, what the procedure is, so how it's done, what materials you need, and when you did it. Okay, so yeah, the same for toys, and identified hazards such as spills or bodily fluids. And if there is no spillage, or there is no blood or mucus or soiling on the toilet floor or anything like that, just write down hypothetically what you would do. And that's for your TAFE assessor to complete. And then the final part is the practical demonstrations. So these are the things that you need to practice on a daily basis while you're on work placement, and then you'll be assessed for them by your TAFE workplace assessor. Remember, somebody from TAFE will come out to assess you. They'll be at the service for perhaps 1.5 to 2 hours maximum, and they will be assessing as many of these practical demonstrations as they can in that time. If your TAFE assessor can't see them, then your workplace supervisor absolutely needs to be able to have seen them and then vouch for you to your TAFE assessor. So you'll need to demonstrate nappy change, and all the information you'll need about how to do a nappy change safely and hygienically in a caring and nurturing way is covered in webinar 2. So all of these demonstrations, the information that you need to be able to carry these out successfully is on the TDC. And is also covered in webinar 2. So if you're not able to do this practically, we can do this in a simulated way, either through our play session, or we can ask you to set up, hypothetically what you might do. And if there's a space in the childcare service, we'll ask if you can set that up nicely to support a mum who is breastfeeding. You also need to be prepared to practice and demonstrate getting some solid food ready for babies and feeding them in their high chair. Responding to babies' cues and signs. So throughout your work placement, you need to be able to identify, when a baby is hungry or tired or overstimulated or needs to be stimulated, that you're picking up on those subtle cues and you're responding appropriately. Again, how to identify these cues is all covered on TDC, and I talk about responding to cues in webinar 2. You need to demonstrate how you can put babies to sleep safely in cots on work placement, and again that's covered in webinar 2 also, and how to provide a safe space that will foster babies' gross motor skills, again on TDC and in webinar 2. And then you need to do all of those things again with toddlers. So either changing a toddler's nappy or assisting them with the toilet, assisting them and engaging with them during mealtime. So again, not just about keeping the mealtimes safe and hygienic, but also ensuring that they're a time where you're developing attachments and relationships, and that they're a nice nurturing time, and that you're transitioning children to the meal times in a slow and calm and positive way. That again, you can respond to toddlers' signs and cues appropriately, so you're tuned in and actively involved, and you're really engaged in that serve and return that we talk about in webinar 2. We need to see you settle toddlers for sleep, not in a cot, but on a stretcher. Again, we'll be looking about the transition to sleep, keeping children calm, making sure they're dressed appropriately for sleep, helping take off their shoes, helping with their bedding, and patting them off to sleep quietly if that's the child's preference, and even helping the child get their comforter for sleep if they use one. And then the same for gross motor skills. We're looking to see how you can monitor and support gross motor skills of toddlers. And then this is the demonstration report that your TAFE assessor and your workplace supervisor will complete. So that's everything for work placement. Again, as always, if you've got any questions, speak with your mentor teacher. And if you're a trainee, I've just realised too, I was addressing this webinar for our virtual students, but if you're a trainee, you'll be doing this obviously in your workplace after you've completed assessments 1 and 2. So again, questions to your mentor teachers. And that concludes our webinars for care and nurturing. All the best with your work placement, and I look forward to catching up with you in the workplace.